Now, accompanying this revival of trade that is going on in Europe, there's also kind of a less visible part of the economic recovery, and that is that in the 15th century in Europe, and actually this probably begins a little bit before the 15th century, but the 15th century is when you see a real explosion in this after the passing of the Black Death and the population is able to rebound. There is a revolution in labor in Europe during this time, and it spawns numerous numerous innovations. It spawns numerous forms of labor. It spawns numerous economic innovations. Right. So this really starts to begin as feudalism dies down. The Black Death kind of puts a stop to it. But then after the Black Death, as the population is rebounding, this really starts to take flight. And essentially, what happens is thanks to the scarcity of labor after the Black Death. I mean, you know, if you think about it, 40 to 60% of the population has died in a period of 6 to 7 years. So that means businesses are without half their staff. Um, these feudal lords and their manors are without half of their workforce. And what this does is this allows peasant and working class laborers to begin to demand more from their employers because there is such a high demand for labor. Everybody needs work. So laborers, workers, the peasant and the working class began to see an improvement in their social standing and in their economic standing because they can demand better wages from their employers. They can demand better working conditions. In many cases, peasants use this opportunity to break their feudal contracts and to leave their lords' manors. In many cases, bankrupting the lords, which coincidentally has the unintended side effect of allowing those lands to be consolidated into these bigger growing states like France, like England, like Spain, like Portugal, right? Now, with the peasant and the working class leaving the feudal manor, leaving their lord's land. During the 15th century, urbanization in Europe soars. Okay. Many of the famous cities of Europe double, triple, quadruple, quintuple in size in less than a century. London by the end of the Black Death has a population of around 60,000. It hits 500,000 by the early part of the 16th century. So urbanization skyrockets, right? Well, in an urban environment where agriculture is not really easy or prevalent, right? People begin to specialize their labor. That means that economic output increases dramatically. People are making goods, they're buying, they're selling them, they're opening businesses, they're paying more taxes, right? Specific cities begin to specialize in certain products. Bordeaux in France becomes the center of a massive wine economy. Flanders in northern Denmark becomes the center of the wool industry. Um, what else? London and southern England becomes the center of a massive dairy and cheese industry. Specific cities in France focus on certain goods, glass, porcelain. The Venetians are really well known for their dyeing and their tapestries and wool and carpets, right? And what you see out of that specialization of not only labor in the cities, but specialization of the cities themselves, was the beginning of what we call trade guilds. And guilds are going to be really, really important in terms of the labor in Europe going forward. Because what trade guilds do is they function kind of like labor unions do today. They function to protect the rights of their laborers. But guilds offer even more than that. They offer financial support for members. They offer apprenticeships. They offer mentorships, right? So essentially, what happens is as you work your way up in the guild and attain higher and higher levels of skill and qualification, you're able to take on trainees, apprentices, things like that, pass your knowledge and your skill down to the next generation for it to be built upon. And this is incredibly important because the creation of trade guilds allows many people in Europe who in the past would have led essentially an unskilled life, doing unskilled labor, doing agriculture on the land of some wealthy landowner and passing on half of their efforts to him in the form of taxes, now have the ability to learn and master a skill very, very early on and then build upon that. And that generational building of knowledge and skill and mastery is what allows Europe in the coming centuries to begin to dominate almost every area of technology. Okay. Um, Europeans are one of the last civilizations to gain access to gunpowder, but within 200 years of the introduction of gunpowder into Europe, Europeans are able to produce guns that are 7 to 8 times more powerful and more accurate than even the Chinese. They're able to produce cannon that fire with more force and fire larger projectiles than the Arab world or the Chinese world. And a big part of that is the creation of these trade guilds, because now you have people in apprenticeships early on in life who are being essentially handed generations of knowledge and generations of innovation and generations of experience at a very young age that they can then build on, innovate on, and push that industry even further than it had ever been, right? Now, another side effect of this economic recovery is that individual wealth increases across the board in Europe. Um, Now, that doesn't mean that everyone's rich, okay? What it means, though, is that the average across all of the people in Europe increases. Um, Families are no longer tied to the land. They have the ability to move between cities to go ply their trade where it's in its highest demand. They have the ability to move city to city, selling goods and selling products, selling their services, right? And this creates a gradual increase in the individual wealth, right? Which again feeds into the cycle of economic recovery, right? The more money you have, the more you can spend. The more you can spend, the better the business that you're spending it at is doing. They can then reinvest that money into building a bigger business or hiring more workers. And now those people are making more money and spending more money. So this is a real kind of positive feedback loop that feeds on itself, right? Um, The more wealth that individuals have, the more taxes that can be collected. The wealth of states grows dramatically as well. This enables them to invest in their people and in their empires and their governments. Infrastructure starts to be rebuilt. Universities are built at an astounding rate. Printing presses begin popping up in major cities all over Europe. Um, Naval fleets, not only for exploration but also for war, begin being built. Kings and princes and wealthy families begin to sponsor navigators and artists and authors. And this is really going to be where the cultural rebirth that we call the Renaissance comes from, right? So let's talk about that cultural rebirth. Um, thanks to the reintegration into trade networks, thanks to the revolution in labor, thanks to the beginning of guilds and apprenticeships, right? Um, there is a more intense cultural diffusion in and out of Europe than there has been in 1,000 years. New technologies, new sciences, new philosophies begin to flourish, right? Now, the majority of these are based upon Greek and Roman models, right? The word Renaissance literally means rebirth. And to a lot of people in this time period, and this is where John Green and I begin to part ways, numerous people within this time period feel as if literally a new age has dawned upon them, and that they are seeing the rebirth of the greatness of Greece and the greatness of the Roman Empire coming back to life 1,000 years after it had vanished. Okay. um, A big part of this is the reintroduction of Greek and Roman texts back into Europe, the work of Aristotle, the work of Plato, the work of Socrates, Thucydides, Herodotus, right? All of these famous authors of the classical era. And even on top of that, many of these works come to Europe with Muslim commentary built into them, where Arab scientists have already been studying this information for hundreds of years, and they've built upon it, and they've commented on it, and they've innovated on it. So Europe gets access to all of this really kind of at its peak, because by this point, thanks to the Mongols, the Muslim world is kind of, at least culturally, in ruins. And so that allows Europe to kind of pick up the mantle and run with it. They very quickly, within about 2 centuries or so, become the leading civilization in terms of math, in terms of science, and in terms of technical innovation, right? Um, so all of this begins to rekindle the desire for scientific inquiry in Europe, and especially in the universities. The number of universities in Europe triples within 200 years, thanks to the introduction of the Gutenberg press and the use of vernacular literature, which is literature that is being written in the local spoken language rather than in the traditional Latin or in the traditional Greek. This helps to increase levels of public education, right? People, more people are able to not only afford books, but they are able to, for the first time in a long time, read them because they are in the same language that they speak locally. And a big side effect of this that is going to really hit home in about 200 years or so is this begins to take control of education within Europe away from the Roman Catholic Church, who had pretty much dominated it since the fall of the Roman Empire. Um, Generally during the Middle Ages, the only people that could read and or write were priests, monks, members of the church. The average citizen, average peasant really had zero reason or zero need to read or write. The only book that was really seen as, worthy of their time was the Bible. And if they wanted to know about the Bible, they just simply needed to talk to their local priest. But during the 15th century, that responsibility for education and that kind of monopoly over education that the Roman Catholic Church has had for about 800 years begins to start to falter and crack at the seams. And education becomes more secular, right? Another thing that contributes to this rebirth of culture in Europe is all of this newly generated wealth, thanks to trade and thanks to the labor revolution. And these newly rich states and these newly rich kings and these newly rich trade families, especially in the Italian city states, begin to patronize artists and authors. They begin to put them on salary. They begin to commission, artistic works and sculpture and things of these nature. And that's really important because you don't get art, unless there's somebody with some money to eventually buy it. And it's really interesting to think about this as a what if scenario where you think all of these magnificent Renaissance artists that everyone's so familiar with, the Boccaccio's and the Raphaels and the Da Vinci's and the Michelangelos and the Botticellis and so on and so on and so on. The list goes on forever. Um, Without this influx of money and wealth coming from the Mediterranean trade and from urbanization, what would have happened to these artistic geniuses? Would these guys have gone on to become artists, or would they have turned into lawyers or doctors or garbage men for all we know, right? Now, another aspect of this cultural rebirth, like I said already, is that it's mainly guided by Greek and Roman influence. This is very prevalent in the artistic expression of the time. It models and even copies to a certain degree Greek styles of art, which are much more natural, which are much more realism based. There's many more human things. There's a focus on the individual rather than religious themes, which had been kind of the only real center of attention in terms of artistic expression. Um, and another really important aspect of this rebirth that starts to develop and take place in Europe at the time is the creation of what we call Renaissance humanism. Now, humanism, like I said at the beginning of the video, is an incredibly influential philosophy that's going to go on to spark the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, a couple of units on down the line here. But in the time period in which we're talking about, Renaissance humanism focuses on human exceptionalism, meaning that humans control their own destiny. They have the ability, they have the the faculties to find their own understanding of the world, right? And this is incredibly important going forward, especially when it comes to the scientific revolution. Um, Up to this point, culturally in Europe, the center of all culture really had been the Roman Catholic Church. And under the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, and under all Christian teachings to some degree, human beings are flawed, they are imperfect, they are born as sinners because of the original sin. And because of that, for a long time, the Roman Catholic Church taught that your only understanding of the world needs to be your understanding of God. The only way that you, as a simple, imperfect human being, could possibly hope to understand the complexities of the universe is to know God. If you know God, then you know the universe, and that's all you need to know. You don't need to go out and investigate things on your own. You don't need to, inquire about the nature of things. Why is the sky blue? Why is water wet? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things, God will enlighten you when he sees fit, right? And Renaissance humanism pushes back against that idea and begins to express the idea that human beings are incredibly capable, they are incredibly individualistic, and each individual is capable of determining their own place in the world rather than having it determined by God. They are capable of inquiring and studying and learning about the world for themselves. They don't have to wait for enlightenment from above. They can go out and find their own understanding of nature, of mathematics, of science, of ethics, of zoology, biology, whatever the case may be. But you, as the individual, have the ability to go out and do things like this for yourself without divine intervention, right? Now, here's the thing to remember about this: this is not a rejection of Christianity, right? This is, at least during the Renaissance time period, seen as a complement to Christianity. That this is, Renaissance humanism is seen as a celebration of the incredible free will and the incredible brain and talents that God has put into mankind, and that mankind should use those to go out and explore God's mysteries that He's laid out for us so that we can better understand him and the way that he works. So, Renaissance humanism by no means is a rejection of religion. It does lead to more secularism, especially in the realm of education, because now people are looking to explore schools of thought outside just Roman Catholic teachings. But by no means is it a rejection of religion. That's going to come later on. That's Martin Luther and a couple, about 100 years or so on down the line is when that's going to take place.